wyszedł. Siema. Elo. Elo mordo. What up? Mówi, tutaj się musi wgrać to wszystko, wiesz, zanim się pouruchomiają te wszystkie, kurde, te wszystkie laserki, komputerki. Trochę czasu zawsze minie, ale po co, nie? No siema. Siema. Zobaczymy, co tu się dzieje, niech mi się nagrzeje. Składnik wstępny.
What happened to Spain? Just a few years ago, Spain was a dream for many Europeans, but today, living there is becoming almost impossible. In 2014, a square meter of apartment in Madrid cost less than 3,000 euros. Today, it's almost 5,000 euros. We're facing a classic housing and living costs crisis, but that's not all. On top of that, there's another tourism crisis unique in Europe. It's not just a few more hotels. It's a whole country dependent on tourists. In 2024, Spain was visited by 94 million people, and Barcelona alone by nearly 15 million, almost 10 times the city's population. Because of this, in September 2025, thousands of Spaniards took to the streets, not against the government, but against tourists. However, to understand today's crisis, we have to go back several decades to the time of General Franco's rule. In the 1950s, Spain was still largely an agricultural country. Poverty prevailed in the countryside. People dreamed of moving to large cities, where there were better jobs and higher wages. But Franco didn't want this. He feared that large population centers in cities would become a hotbed of political rebellion and a threat to the regime. Therefore, he introduced a system of relocation permits. Without official documentation, you couldn't change provinces. In practice, hundreds of thousands of people were stuck in the countryside, living in poverty and without prospects. However, in the 1960s, the regime was forced to relent. Social pressure and the need for new factory workers were too great. Permits were abolished, and the largest internal migration in Spanish history occurred. Nearly 10 million people changed their residences, compared to a population of 32 million at the time. This meant that 1 in 3 Spaniards moved to cities. To counter this wave, Franco ordered the mass construction of affordable housing in metropolitan areas. Simple, cramped, but affordable. As a result, the percentage of homeowners in the country jumped from 45% in 1950 to 70% in 1970. In Barcelona itself, the increase was even more spectacular. Only 5% of families owned a home in 1950, rising to 38% in 1970. From then on, housing began to be perceived not as a service but as capital and investment. Banks supported this model by offering mortgages, and politicians encouraged homeownership, viewing it as a foundation for social stability. It was this mentality, inherited from the Francoist era, that would shape the market for decades to come. The 1980s were a time of great transformation for Spain. Industry was losing its importance, factories were disappearing, and unemployment was breaking records. In some years, it reached as high as 20%. A country that had just joined the European community needed a new economic anchor, and then came 1992. Barcelona hosted the Summer Olympics. It was a turning point for the city itself, as well as for Spain as a whole. Hosting the Games opened the door to a nationwide redevelopment and Spain's largest image-building investment in decades. The transportation system was redesigned, the district was renovated, and former industrial zones were transformed into service and recreation areas. The city was redesigned, not for residents, but for visitors from abroad. This was the moment Spain realized that its new future lay not in factories, but in beaches and hotels. From then on, Tourism began to grow at a pace never before seen in the country. But this success also had a dark side. When the entire economy began to rely on tourism, the country became hostage to the holiday season. But as long as the system held, no one worried. At the beginning of the 20th century, Spain experienced a veritable construction frenzy. Between 2006 and 2007, over 600,000 new apartments were built annually. That's more than Germany, France, and Italy combined. On paper, it looked like an economic miracle. Spain grew faster than most of Europe, with construction accounting for over 12% of GDP and a quarter of all new jobs. Unfortunately, it was a bubble fueled by debt and speculation. Thousands of new apartments were being built in rural towns. While Madrid and Barcelona were paying, there was a shortage of available rental apartments. Finally, in 2008, the bubble burst, construction ground to a halt, banks collapsed, and hundreds of thousands lost their jobs. Unemployment rose from 8% to a record 26% in 2013. This meant that 1 in 4 working-age Spaniards was unemployed. Over 1.5 million apartments remained empty and unsold, and entire rural neighborhoods turned into Whitma towns. Thousands of families couldn't repay their loans, and banks foreclosed on their homes. Thus was born the mortgage generation, young adults who, for decades, paid off apartments whose market value had fallen by as much as half. It was the greatest social crisis since and at the same time, a turning point, because the country that had just moments before been building itself into a powerhouse suddenly had to look for a new lifeline, and that lifeline turned out to be tourism. Have you ever wondered how much sugar is hidden in most of the drinks we drink every day? Sugar is literally everywhere. In energy drinks, in soft drinks, even in drinks that only pretend to be light. But there's an alternative, and it's holly. In short, holly is zero sugar, zero aspartame, and zero artificial flavors, added vitamins, and over 40 different delicious fruit flavors. The offer includes iced tea infused drinks, hydration shakes with electrolytes, energy drinks with caffeine, and dessert milkshakes. However, I personally recommend starting with the starter kit to test out the different varieties, and once you find your favorite, you can grab a larger can, where with my discount code, a single serving costs around 3 zloty. Additionally, if you don't like the product, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you're risk-free. You'll find the link to the website and the code in the description and pinned comment. In 2013, the government relaxed regulations on short-term rentals. This was a green card for platforms like Airbnb. Within a few years, entire neighborhoods in Barcelona and Madrid began to transform. Townhouses that had previously housed families were transformed into vacation apartments. In 2019, there were over 18,000 active Airbnb listings in Barcelona alone. This is more than the number of municipal apartments in the entire city, and it's enough to effectively drive up prices. When a landlord has the choice of renting an apartment to a family for €900 or to a tourist for a few nights, both values, the decision becomes obvious. Another paradox arises. Spain currently has approximately 3.8 million empty apartments, or about 14% of its total stock. Even in the most crowded city of Barcelona, the figure is almost 9%, yet young people still have nowhere to live. This is the irony of the Spanish crisis, which has been causing "tourists go home" signs to appear on Barcelona's walls for years. And if we take a closer look, the situation gets even worse. Spain is currently experiencing one of the most dramatic generational shifts in Europe. Over the past 10 years, young adults' wages have increased by a mere 23%. This sounds good until we compare this to the housing market. At the same time, apartment prices have skyrocketed by over 90%. In Madrid and Barcelona, renting a small apartment now consumes more than half the average salary. This means that after paying rent, people can't afford anything more, neither for their family nor for their future. By comparison, in Germany or Austria, rent averages 30% of income. In Spain, it's often 55 to 60%. That's why a growing number of Spaniards aged 25 to 34 are simply not moving out. According to Eurostat, as many as 65% of young Spaniards live with their parents, one of the highest rates in the entire EU. The result is simple. The fertility rate is falling. Spain is among the countries with the lowest birth rate in the entire European Union, with a fertility rate of around 1.2 children per woman. This means that society is shrinking and aging at a record pace. And this isn't just a problem in large cities. In the countryside, the crisis is even worse. Villages are emptying, schools are closing, and entire regions are losing their inhabitants. In some provinces of Castile and Leon, over 70% of municipalities now have fewer than 1,000 inhabitants. Those with ambition and energy are leaving for Germany, France, or the Netherlands. Those who have nowhere to flee are left. This is where the housing crisis intersects with the demographic crisis, spelling even greater long-term problems for Spain. The decline is total. The mayor's office has been in a state of disarray for a long time, but the government pretended the problem would resolve itself, until public pressure was so intense that the state had to step in. In 2023, Ley de Vivienda was passed. This law introduced new tools, such as the ability to designate tight rent zones. It introduced a cap on rent increases and a vacancy tax, which was intended to force landlords to rent out unused premises. On paper, this seemed like a well-thought-out plan, but in practice, implementation has been slow and fraught with bureaucracy. Landlords are circumventing the regulations, local governments are struggling to keep up, and prices continue to rise faster than politicians can react. The main problem is that some regulations are having the opposite effect than intended. Landlords fear the new limits and, instead of renting long-term, prefer to either sell their apartments or list them on Airbnb, where there is much less control. As a result, the number of rental apartments is decreasing, and competition between tenants is driving up prices even further. We've seen similar stories before in Europe. In Berlin, after the introduction of rent caps in 2020, many landlords withdrew their apartments from the market, and rents and legal listings, instead of falling, rose even faster when the law was repealed. Spain risks a return to this scenario. Barcelona decided to go even further. In 2024, a historic decision was announced: the liquidation of 10,000 tourist apartments by 2028. And here arises the key question: is the state truly controlling the housing market or merely reacting to crises it itself has previously provoked? Adding to these high prices is another often overlooked problem. Spain has some of the most stringent tenant protection laws in Europe. This sounds good until the landlord encounters a dishonest tenant. Eviction can last for months, even years, and this is not a new phenomenon. Back in the 1990s, the process could drag on for over a year, and after the 2008 crisis, the problem exploded. Thousands of families defaulted on their loans and rent, and the anti-Duccio movement blocked bailiffs. Since then, every government has promised reforms, but the system has remained virtually unchanged. In 2023, there were over 38,000 eviction cases nationwide. In Barcelona and Madrid, there were cases where families occupied apartments without paying rent for over 2 years, while the landlord continued to cover the loan and other charges. Then there's the phenomenon of so-called occupations, the illegal occupation of empty apartments. According to court data, in 2022 alone, police recorded over 16,000 cases of occupations, the highest in Catalonia, which has long been considered the capital of occupations in Europe. All of this means many owners are simply giving up on long-term rentals. It's better to list an apartment on Airbnb, where payment is made up front, than risk a tenant who can't be evicted. As a result, the rental market shrinks even further, and the housing crisis only deepens. Recently, and this is in great part due to its tourism industry, which contributes around 13% of GDP growth and is once again breaking records. But besides the problems with tenants and rising rents, there's another serious problem. For years, Spain built its economy on tourism and housing, but apartments are increasingly no longer just homes for people but are becoming financial assets for investors. Foreign funds are buying entire property portfolios. Large corporations treat Spanish apartment blocks like stocks. Buy a Danio, wait for the value to rise, and sell for a profit. This means ordinary Spaniards have to compete not with their neighbors but with global capital. And the problems don't end with apartments. Foreign companies are also taking over key economic sectors, such as energy, insurance, and banking. Decisions on prices and investments are increasingly being made in London, Frankfurt, or New York, rather than Madrid or Barcelona. As a result, Spain is losing not only control over its housing market, but also influence over where the entire economy develops. And this is precisely the greatest threat, because if the country stops deciding on its own future, who will actually shape it? The government itself is aware of the dire situation. In 2025, a 100% tax on apartment purchases by non-EU residents who do not live in Spain was even proposed. This was intended to discourage foreign capital from buying apartments, but this law remains only a draft and raises serious doubts about both its effectiveness and compliance with EU law. However, the very fact that politicians are resorting to such radical ideas demonstrates how deep the crisis has become. Spain has become a symbol of the paradox of modern Europe, a holiday paradise on post.
Witam Jackie? Stałem się w robocie, zostawiłem. Zostawiłem. Samo. Gdzie moje spodnie? Też zostawiłem. O dzidziuś. O dzidziuś. O dzidziuś. Już. O dzidziuś. O dzidziuś. What is this? Ślęży. Godzina. Pół godzina. Może pół godzina. Dobra. Dobrze, dobrze. Dobra. W takim oto miłego dnia.